Hi everyone, welcome to our Financial Mail webinar, examining the issue of whether the auditing industry is in crisis and what to do about it. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers in this, and we have a report which we published today in the Financial Mail in conjunction with Open Secrets, in which they looked at the auditing industry and looked at the problems, several case studies, as well as the potential reforms. We're going to go into the two authors of that, Michael Marchant and Mamello Mosiana, are going to give a short introduction of it, and then we're going to have a short Q&A session with our panelists, and then everyone gets a chance to ask questions and ask the tough questions of our very smart panel members. So I think right off the bat, Michael, can we go to you, and then Mamello perhaps to discuss just, I suppose, an overview of your findings and the report.
Thanks very much, Rob. Good afternoon as well to everyone who's joining us. It's really exciting to have so many people part of this discussion. You know, one of the major things Open Secrets was hoping for on the back of this report was to generate a discussion, a public discussion, which I think is already happening in some places around the auditing profession and where it's implicated in cases of fraud and corruption, both in the public and the private sector, and prompt a critical discussion about what can be done about it. So the report is the second volume in a series that Open Secrets publishes. And for those who aren't aware of Open Secrets, we're a small nonprofit organization that undertake investigations, advocacy, and litigation around issues of economic crime, but particularly focused on the private sector and where corporations are involved in both corruption, but more broadly kind of economic crime. So the series is called the Corporations and Economic Crime Report. The first volume was published in 2018 and also looked at a sector, it looked at the banking sector. And what it tried to focus on was some of the stories around the role of banks in money laundering in South Africa over a wide period of time, from the apartheid era through to today, and particularly around state capture and the role of banks in laundering funds linked to the Guptas and other families linked to state capture. And following on from that, Open Secrets, Mamello and I in particular, started working on a project linked specifically to state capture and preparing a submission to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry on what we've called the private enablers of state capture. And that very quickly took us into the world of audit firms, both audit firms in the sense of the traditional sense of auditors doing audit work, but also, as Mamello will speak about, the increasing sort of the role of those audit firms as consultants. That was where the entry point was with KPMG and the stories about state capture. And what I think we started to see very quickly was that this was not, or from our perspective, not just a KPMG problem, that you had a lot of the big four engaged in similar ways as the state-owned enterprises in various contracts that appeared to be very suspicious. And then at the same time, we have these really massive case studies that are breaking, stories that are breaking in the private sector. We have what's happening at Steinhoff, at Tonga, at Hewlett. We have the looting of VBS Bank. And so what we've done, and I think just to be clear with what this report is that this report is not predominantly made up of new information. What rather we've done is we've tried to bring together what's in the public domain and what is being written about by journalists, activists, and academics about the auditing profession. And we've tried to draw out what some of the themes are and what we can do about the problem. And so this is very much a report that hopes to prompt discussion about the industry. And I think Mamello might want to say a little bit more about precisely what's in the report, some of the case studies that we look at.
Yeah. So we framed the report around actually a couple of case studies, but we wanted to start with sort of a theoretical discussion, discussing the origins, I guess, of auditing itself from bean counters to today, and surveying the literature as well, and basically outlining how the Big Four became the Big Four auditors. But before we did the theoretical framework, we thought it was important to actually set the scene in why we think this is important. And we think this is important because primarily auditing should serve a social utility. It should be the checks and balances on the on capitalism and on corporations and even public sector. And that's what we do in the first part of the report. In our introduction, we speak about wealth inequality, and we speak about the state in which South Africa is in, and how auditors and accountants, I guess, play a role in that. And then in our second chapter, we then look at auditing and the history of capitalism, really. And then we go into our case studies. Our case studies are split into both the private sector and also the public sector. And we thought that was an important way to actually just show that the ubiquitous way in which auditors play a role in our society. So then we started first with the two big ones, Steinhoff and Tongaat. And then we go into VBS. The VBS case study is also featured in the first volume of the Corporations and Economic Crime Report. This in that part, we talked about the bankers and the offshore world a little bit. This hones in on the auditor's role. And then we go into a case study on SAA, and that is some of the newer material. It's framed a lot by a whistleblower. It's a very exciting part of the report for us. And it also includes some more talk about the Auditor General's role. And then we go into broader SOEs and state capture, and we look at SARS, we look at ESCOM, and we look at KPMG's role in a lot of other places. And we look at the way, again, the same actors all facilitate similar kinds of financial crime or corporate malfeasance. And from there on, we look at the lack of absence and accountability. Why is it that there hasn't been why is it that these incidents haven't led to mass scale overhaul or at least a reform of the industry? And then why there's a need basically to reform the industry. And then from then on, we lay out our recommendations, which we'll talk about later. I think Mike will talk about that as the conversation moves along.
Let me unmute myself. Guys, what we should do, I think, is just have a general discussion. We've got some fantastic experts on the subject with us today, in Bernard Agulhas, who, as of this week, has left IRBA, which is the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors. They are essentially the regulatory body. That's the organization you go to ensure probity in the industry. When things go wrong, people approach IRBA. There's been much written about where IRBA is, and this week, who replaced Bernard at IRBA, Janita John, who was the head of the audit committee at Tongaat Hewlett, which has created a few ructions. We can talk about that later. And we have Khaya Sithole. I think many of you know Khaya as an outspoken critic, commentator, accounting lecturer. I mean, he knows his stuff. So I think it's going to be a great discussion, guys. Can I ask, just to start off, can I ask a devil's advocate question, Michael? I mean, essentially, are we not making the auditors carry the can for unethical business practices in South Africa? We have the corporate sector and SOEs, where people have just done what they wanted and there's been zero accountability. We can't seem to put anyone in jail for Steinhoff. We can't seem to ensure accountability at ESCOM. So we're not just blaming the auditors for this. I mean, are we being unfair to the auditors or not?
So to give the short answer up front, I don't think we're being unfair to the auditors in this case, but you do raise such an important point, Rob, which is that this is, and we make this point in the report, this is a systemic problem. And so if you look at the role of corporate executives in very high level fraud at places like Steinhoff and Tongaat, it is a serious consequence of the erosion of the capacity of the state, particularly high-level investigative bodies like the Hawks and then the prosecuting authority. That is one of the reasons why we're not seeing prosecutions quickly enough on some of those cases. I think the movement at last to prosecute those implicated in VBS is such an important moment for that reason, because it shows that these things are possible. And the fact that Sipho Malaba, the KPMG auditor implicated there, was one of those who is charged, along with those at the PIC, shows that the MPA is looking at those different role players. But I think the reason that it raises such an important point to kind of get out the way up front is that this is something certainly that I think the audit profession relies on, which is to say that we need to blame the executives who are misrepresenting things in the books. And you can't really blame us when those people are going out of their way to either misrepresent things or lie to the public. And there's a truth in that, in the sense that they have to be held accountable. But the audit profession, and what we're kind of provocating here with this report, is that it's time to reflect on, if the audit profession is unable to identify those things using the professional guide requirements that we have for them, things such as showing the adequate professional skepticism, using your knowledge of the context and details of what's happening at a business or a state-owned enterprise to realize where risk factors are and where there's a high probability of fraud and corruption, and therefore reporting on those things. If they're unable to do that, we really have to revisit the value of what that audit is providing and reconsider what it can deliver. I think that's the one point. And then the second point is that if you look at some of the case studies that we are looking at, Steinhoff might be an outlier case in terms of the sophisticated multi-jurisdictional nature of the fraud. But many of the case studies we're looking at, we do not think that it would have taken too much for the auditors to identify that there at least was something suspicious going on. If you look at the South African Airways case study, the external auditors, PwC, had to have been fully aware of what had been reported within SAA about the state of the internal audit at SAA, which was an absolute mess. And our argument there is that then inevitably leads you as an auditor, that kind of professional requirement to report on those things, including contraventions of the law. And I think the final point that I'd make on this side is that the other reason that I think we shouldn't let the auditors off and we have to demand more is to return to Mamello's point, which is that these errors have catastrophic human consequences. It's not simply a matter of faith in companies and the economy and what that means for investment, which I think is crucial in the context of South Africa now. But if you look at case studies like Eskom, SAA in the public sector, and then cases in the private sector as well, is that this is ultimately the theft of people's pension money. It's the looting of bank accounts at VBS. And it's the theft of public funds, which is all of our money, that diverts it towards state-owned enterprises when it should be going to more essential spending. And so that reframing it, I think, as a public interest issue is also helpful in trying to hold those auditors to a higher standard.
Okay, it's valid. Bernard, can I bring you in on this conversation? And can I cast your mind back to the heady, innocent days of 2017, before we knew about things like Steinhoff? In IRBA's annual report at the time, you wrote that every day there's been a new headline suggesting that KPMG's current woes are the result of a corrupted system that has failed to protect the public. While there are many good auditors doing good work and delivering excellent audit quality, these just don't make the headlines. So to say we have a failed system is a misguided perception. That doesn't mean our profession doesn't have issues to address. Bernard, can I ask, I mean, that was a few weeks before Steinhoff collapsed, and you know, it wasn't just KPMG, then it was Deloitte, we've had SAA, we've had PwC, we have issues right down the line. Have you revised your ideas of just how systemic this is? Is it far wider than you initially expected? I mean, do you still, I suppose, believe in that essential statement?
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for the opportunity. And also, let me start off by congratulating Open Secrets for an excellent report. I think it was important to raise awareness amongst the public of what is happening in the profession. And as was mentioned, it certainly draws together information that's already out there in the public domain, but very important to at least, again, emphasize what the role of the various stakeholders are. Well, firstly, since 2017, what has become more clear to myself is that this is a systemic problem, and it does involve not just the auditors, it does involve all the role players in the financial reporting chain. And if we look at any business failure or audit failure, it's a failure in the entire system. But maybe at the time I talked about the role of auditors and the fact that not all auditors were bad apples, as we mentioned. But we have to admit, though, that auditors are expected to do a lot more. And the public's expectation is not unreasonable, because if something is missed in the business by all those other role players, then the expectation is that the auditors come in and not miss the obvious, and that they are accountable to the stakeholders, to the shareholders, to pick up these issues that are sometimes glaring. It's not always related to fraud, so it's not always something that the auditors can say they should not have picked up. So certainly KPMG in 2016, what I also said at the time was that the only difference between KPMG and the other firms was that the light was shone on KPMG, but it didn't mean that we weren't expecting that we will uncover maybe some other firms also being implicated in some of these wrongdoings. At the time, I also believed that all of this still meant that auditors behaved professionally and did not really get involved in corruption or such misconduct. But since then, and the examples mentioned in the open secret reports does start to implicate the auditors in corruption and fraud, and not just in unethical behavior or not complying with the auditing standards. So I'd say that since 2016, things have certainly moved on and perceptions have changed. And the IRBA had to respond to that. And in the last 2 years, we've been working very hard to restore confidence by implementing some of the recommendations, as mentioned, the open secrets reports, some of the recommendations in the Bryden report in the UK. But we'll have to continue to work to restore the confidence. One of the comments made in Bryden is that the audit report should, or the audit opinion should not be about the financial state of the company, but rather to give the assurance. It should be based, the definition of audit should be to give assurance to those that rely on it. And I fully agree that the losses that we've experienced to pensioners, to shareholders, to the public at large in the past, it cannot continue. And something has to be done to make sure that those that are responsible for that or implicated in it needs to be held accountable.
That's true, and we'll certainly get to the Bryden report just now, because I think it's an important part of the reform of the industry. But Khaya, can I ask, I mean, you've seen this industry close up for ages. You have expressed your concerns about the governance in auditing firms. I mean, you know, it's KPMG certainly isn't an outlier. I mean, what are your thoughts on how deep this rot goes?
Good afternoon to everyone. Look, I think for me, the issue is that historically, perhaps the way the profession has been structured always gave rise to the possibility that such issues may become quite systemic and not many people will be able to pick them up. So I think we do need to start with the fact that this profession operates in rather opaque, models that are very different from what other businesses do. Is something that for me has always been a concern for a very long time. And I think a few years ago, I actually expressed an opinion that it was quite ironic that, auditors are the type of people that go to other businesses and say, look, here's your public interest score, so therefore this is what you need to do, this is what you need to disclose to the public. But for me, auditing firms themselves have got a much higher public interest role to play. So of course, the fact that you and I can go and access the financial statements of every listed entity, but we cannot access the financial statements of the auditing firms was already the mismatch that actually didn't make sense in my view. And I think obviously the public interest component of it is very important when we talk about this profession, because long before we actually put the term of public interest score in the Companies Act in 2008, auditors by definition were already designed or at least conceptualized to serve the public interest. So ironically, they should have led the issues around transparency and all those type of things. So for me, that was the issue that thought was unique to the profession. But I do suspect that what we're now seeing is that just like when people say racism is not new, but just is being filmed, I think here, similar with the auditing profession, the types of issues that we're seeing now are not new. These are the issues that have been happening in one way or another. But in this particular instance, now there's been a lot of bigger corporate failures, entities that were so explicit in the public domain. It then allowed a lot more people to be able to put the spotlight onto the role the auditors ought to play, or at least were expected to play. So it's really a reflection of a pre-existing type of a set of systemic issues, but unfortunately in the context we're much.
Khaya, I'm not sure, is your line okay? Guys, well, I'm not sure if it's just my line. I hope not. But Michael, can I move on and ask a question? In terms of in the report, there's a line there saying that the auditors say they can't actually take responsibility for much of what goes wrong. They say that they say that they rely on the honesty of their corporate clients. Now, if this is the case, it's hard to see what function auditor really plays. The public doesn't need an auditor to report what the CEO says, and so the point is they have to perform some other function. So it's not good enough in terms of accountability to just say that this is what the CEO told us, right? I mean, one of the big issues that comes out in the themes in your report is the lack of accountability for what goes wrong, and we've seen that in VBS and many other cases. I mean, is that a valid concern? The lack of accountability being the primary problem here?
I think it is one of the major problems here, is that you don't see real consequences when things go wrong. And I think that one of the problems here is that what we do have in South Africa, at least on paper, is that we have a fairly good structure that gives responsibilities to the role players at every single level. And so if you have the board of an SOE or the board of a company, they have very rigorous and extensive duties in terms of reporting accurately, being honest, not defrauding the company, and reporting to the public. And then you've got a series of role players as well who are then responsible for various stages of that governance. You look at the VBS case study and the SAA case study, I think they really highlight the fact that this is often a multiple failure. So for example, we focus a lot on the external auditors, which is important because they're public facing. One of the things that arises in those case studies is, what about the internal auditors? At VBS, that was PwC, who were let go very soon by the liquidators. But in both those cases, the internal auditors are supposed to be helping the organizations build compliance systems and frameworks that will actually work for internal control. And then the external auditors are relying on those systems to work, but also should be identifying where those systems aren't working and using them to report concerns. And what we're seeing in many cases is that both of those parties are failing. And yet, one of the significant issues is that we don't see, for internal auditors, we see almost no accountability. You look at the South African Airways case study, the internal auditors went to a disciplinary with the Institute for Internal Auditors, admitted that most of their notes were handwritten, that anyone in the organization could access the audit notes, they could backdate them. I mean, really just like showing absolutely systemic breakdown of the internal audit system. Nothing came of that hearing. And then in terms of the PwC case at SA, yes, there was some accountability there in terms of a fine from IRBA for both PwC and Nkonki. But one of the things I think the other panel members will touch on, and something we've certainly put forward, is that the sanctions from IRBA are simply not high enough to really hold people to account and act as a sufficient disincentive for this kind of conduct. And so what we're starting to see is something that we've highlighted in other sectors, such as the banks, which is, are we seeing an industry increasingly making the bet that long-term relationships with very lucrative fees can often justify being caught out every now and then, because both from the individual auditor perspective, but also the company, is the calculus that no hard accountability is going to come about. And I think shifting that around, both from the regulatory space on the professional side, but also law enforcement, which is a very important thing when an actual crime has taken place, those reforms are essential because you have to change the calculus for the consequences when you're found to have done wrong.
Law enforcement seems more intent on making sure nobody smokes at the moment than doing anything else, or kicking people out of shacks in Khaya. Khaya, can I come back to you for a second? I think the VBS case marks something of a change. It marks something of a watershed in that what happened there is that the auditor himself is actually accused of corruption, essentially looking the other way, and in exchange for 33 million or whatever it was. We've had lots of cases of auditors messing up. And you could say that's Steinhoff, you could say that's Tongot, you could say a lot of them, they might have just messed up because they just aren't good enough or for whatever reason. But the VBS case to me seems like a bit of a change where there's actual corruption involved. Is that right?
Yeah, I think what was unique about the VBS case is that you had one person who was supposed to be playing this independent oversight role, being then actively involved in the type of corruption that in most other cases, auditors are like, well, we also didn't know. So what made that one quite different is that, obviously the audit team couldn't use the same argument that we've heard in any other cases, which is to say, look, we relied on the quality of the information that was provided to us. We exercised our judgment, and at the point in time, we thought those were the right conclusions. So it is indeed a watershed moment, because now you actually had to ask yourself the question of, well, if an audit partner is going to be in charge of a particular engagement, does this mean that he's a lone ranger, which means that absolutely nobody else sort of checks the works that he does, looks at the reasonability of the conclusions that he's reaching? Because that, for me, then calls into question the type of quality assurance work that goes on behind the scenes. Unfortunately for KPMG, this wasn't a standalone issue, because it then transpired that the reason that they cite for disowning the SARS rogue unit report, for example, is that yet again, you had one particular partner fully in charge of the process from start to inception, without him having a sounding board of somebody else saying, well, let me look at conclusions you're drawing based on the information that you're having, and then see whether that makes sense or not. So I do think that it then forced us not only to confront the fact that we had an auditor actively engaged in a form of corruption, but also started inviting the questions around the behind the scenes type of work that does occur in auditing firms, because it is quite risky to assume that one single individual can be fully in charge of a process, can be able to override the juniors in the way that Malaba was able to do, and to then assume that that's the way that the auditing process works. If that is indeed the case, then that's completely unacceptable. It is far too risky, not just for auditing firms themselves, but also for the nation at large, because we then have to assume that Malaba is not a standalone rogue unit. Malaba is a member of a society in which we all live. And if one person can do it, it may take 5 or 10 or 15 years time, but somebody else will find that perhaps the incentives being offered, which in this case was obviously the 30 million rand or whatever it was that was offered to him on the side, was far more lucrative than the partnership share that he was getting from doing the audit itself. So I do think that it made it a watershed moment, because not only did we have to, were we able to see the corruption element, but also then the question of what really happens behind the scenes in terms of the quality assurance processes that are being practiced at the auditing firms.
Guys, sorry about that. Just a second break. Can I ask Mamello, if I go to you? I think what Khaya mentioned is, he talks about the culture of the auditing companies. And it's a very important issue. I think in the VBS case, we had a case where the juniors did actually raise these issues with the seniors, and nothing happened as a result. I mean, I think that speaks to just what Khaya was talking about, the lack of oversight, the lack of a proper culture that should encourage us to come to the top. I mean, can you talk a bit about that and why you think that might be so? And
one of the things that, yeah, I unmuted myself. One of the things that we saw in during like a scoping of the issues was that often at times it is the juniors who do report, who do see these things, and they're often shut down by seniors. And this is because in the sense that the seniors want to keep the relationship that they have with their companies or with the public sector actors that they are engaging with. And any sort of reporting of irregularities or showing unfavorable things is actually going to be more punitive to the junior than it would be for the company that's being audited. So in that sense, it tends to silence a lot of people. And you see it across the board, and it's a global issue. I think we've seen just a couple of months ago how EY had to pay, has been fined like 11 million pounds because of a whistleblower at Kaloti at the Dubai refinery. And because people are treated very harshly when they speak out, he'd spotted that this company was doing some money laundering. And when he reported this, he was told to keep quiet and then eventually forced out of the company. And this is not just about what happens in the books of companies or the books of public sector actors. It's also in just the culture of the organization itself, reporting about the things that are happening there. And there was an interesting investigation by Madison Marriage from Financial Times that actually showed how even when women in the industry and women and people of color were reporting discrimination within the big four companies. And this is again a US or a global study. And it showed that oftentimes those women were either made to sign non-disclosure agreements, told to keep quiet, told that it would be bad because it meant that you wouldn't move up in the company. And that's one of the other things that makes a lot of young auditors also keep quiet, because the thing is, it becomes more lucrative once you become a partner. And to make partner, you guys have to play by the rules of the game. And if the rules of the game are you become complicit in looking away or perhaps being silent when you shouldn't be, then they do that because, again, you want to do well in your job or your industry. And sometimes doing well, as we've seen in these case studies, is actually being complicit in a lot of financial malfeasance. And that is something that is cultural and might need like a lot of introspection by the audit industry. And I think that's why it's very good to have this discussion, hopefully with lots of young auditors, like, and also older ones, thinking about how the industry operates as a whole.
Older auditors, if they're anything like me, they'll have struggled with Zoom, never mind joining this webinar. But Bernard, I wanted to ask, I mean, I think what Mamello speaks about, the cultural issue is vital. And I think there is this sense that perhaps companies have got too close to their auditors. I think one of the figures in the Open Secrets report is that 25% of audit committees of JSE companies in the top 40 are headed by somebody who is from their auditor. There's this permeable barrier between auditors and companies. Does this contribute towards the culture where you have potentially a lack of independence? I think of Tongaat Hewlett, where Deloitte has been the auditor for 80 years. I mean, surely that's the kind of thing that erodes independence and doesn't help with, keeping a skeptical mindset.
Yeah. Rob, I want to come back to the question that you asked earlier. I think it also appears in the report about the auditors saying that they rely on what the management tells them. And therefore, it's not really their fault if they miss anything. Now, I have a very strong view on that. And it comes back to the fact that a lot of the root causes that we find in the investigations that we do is auditors' behavior. And when I talk about the auditors' behavior, I'm referring to the fact that auditors has stopped to be skeptical and ask questions from their clients. So an auditor cannot say that they rely on what the client tells them. That is in fact the very reason why the standards include an auditor to be, or requires an auditor to be, skeptical. The auditor has to ask the right questions. Now, earlier we also talked about this entire system, the comprehensive system of financial reporting, which includes audit committees. And when I talk about being skeptical, it's not limited to auditors only. It's also limited to other structures like the audit committees. And I've often heard audit committee members say that they also have been fooled and misled and hoodwinked by the client or by the management. That is not acceptable. as skeptical as auditors should be, those charged with governance should be equally skeptical. So it comes back to their behavior, and they're expected to ask the right questions. But the reasons that these questions aren't asked anymore, or the auditors and even the audit committees, given that, as the report says, 25% of audit committee chairs come from the audit firms, and it just operates like a revolving door, most of them are too close to their clients to ask the right questions. They have become too complacent. They are too close to them. And it goes back to the long relationships that they have had with them. And that is why I believe that one of the critical factors that contribute to these business failures from an audit committee perspective and the audit failures from an auditor perspective is the lack of independence. And therefore, most of the initiatives that need to be addressed in the auditing profession is to strengthen the auditor's independence, and similarly the independence of those charged with governance. Because unless they are independent, they won't ask the right questions, and they won't challenge the management, and they won't challenge, the auditors won't challenge the directors when it comes to asking the difficult questions. They just accept it. And we've seen that in most of these audit failures that we're investigating, it's because the auditors hadn't been sufficiently skeptical. And that's why I bring back a lot of the issues to not auditors not being technically competent, but auditors not being behaviorally competent.
Oh, that's an important point. One of the things you flagged in your report as well, Mamello, is that one of the reasons for the potential lack of independence is the fact that the business structure indicates that you have to be a lot friendlier to companies than you might be if you're just auditing them. Most of the money now comes from consulting, not auditing. So when you have that kind of relationship, you have a conflict of interests. I mean, traditional auditors are now advising companies on how to move their money offshore, how to do all kinds of other things, which potentially compromises their ability to be firm on audits. Do you feel that that's a real danger? I mean, we've had this debate, I suppose, since Arthur Andersen and Enron, but it seems to be something that hasn't been resolved.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be going away, and it really marks kind of the shift of the industry as a whole. Whereas it started providing one particular service, which is accounting and auditing, it's sort of moved on now to mostly doing consulting, and a lot of this is based on relationships again, and it's about long embedded relationships where you see kind of these people become sort of like a cabal of sorts. They are spending a lot of time together to the extent that they become sort of a part of the company. And one of the things that actually compromises audits is that the auditor would not want to risk losing out on the consulting side of the business. And that is, again, the most lucrative side. So in order to balance those, auditors might overlook things that they actually shouldn't. And that's what you saw again with the Arthur Andersen thing at Enron, was that they then started to participate in creating these odd accounting practices rather than actually checking that and making sure that wasn't happening. And yeah, again, it's how these things are embedded into the culture of how organizations behave, and again, will last much longer.
Khaya, can I ask on this? We've seen a situation where, one auditor messes up. We have a very small community of 4 auditors that, according to the report, form a quasi-cartel. One auditor messes up, like Deloitte with Steinhoff, and another goes and cleans up after them, does a forensic investigation. Yet PwC themselves were implicated in issues involving SAA and others. It seems like this, these 4, it's a very convenient thing. One guy messes up. And then at Steinhoff, for example, I think Steinhoff spent 600 million paying PwC for their forensic report. I mean, it indicates so many things that seem intuitively wrong, but one of them is that it seems there are just too few players. Is that right?
Yes, I do think the fact that the market concentration is just really centered around the 4 multinational big 4 firms is an ongoing and a pervasive problem that we've always spoken about in this particular industry. And I think the risk that we have here, of course, is that if one of the big 4 is really caught up in a situation which requires somebody else with a new set of eyes to come and look at it, the type of companies that are in those positions inevitably gravitate towards one of the big four members. And I think the risk that exists then is that firstly, these big four then become too big to fail, on the basis that then there is anxieties around what would happen if one of them fell, for example. This became topical around the KPMG issues a few years ago. And then also, not only do they become too big to fail, what that does is that it entrenches their legitimacy within the system, because what we always say, and I think the Open Secrets reports also reflects on this, is the fact that what they've got is this soft and unspoken, license from the state, because for as long as states are across the world saying an audit is necessary, then of course auditors know that business is assured. So of course they're always going to be there. Now the key issue that we need to be able to deal with is that now that we've seen, with the benefit of hindsight since the fall of Enron, that these are the risks that emerge when just four players of scale are the ones that can tap into. Should we then look at how we can broaden the market so that when one of them is implicated in this, then we don't start panicking around the question of what would happen if they fell down, in instances where perhaps them being collapsed would be the legitimate response based on the scale and really the nature of what they've been involved in. So I do think that the market concentration is a fundamental problem across the world. But of course, the history of how we end up with the market concentration is really a question of economics. And when I say it's a question of economics, it is a reality that it is these big four firms that are able to say, we've got the widest and the most diverse international networks. So if you're a business like Sithole, for example, that's operating in every corner of the globe, you're not going to hire Khaya, small auditing firm from Johannesburg. You're going to look for the biggest multinational firm, which has the cross-border expertise in order to be able to ensure that there's a seamless transition or a seamless process within the audit. So that is really a fundamental reason why the market power is so much greater. And I think obviously in the long run, we do have to ask ourselves the question, will there ever be an instance where the concept of too big to fail does itself become the primary risk? Would this mean that if any of them screwed up, we'll simply say, well, we have to maintain them on the basis that no one else is able to step up? And that if that is indeed the risk, then we have to ask ourselves the question of how do we then amplify or widen the market so that we are not really captured by just four players that are able to dictate to the market what to be done. The other issue, Rob, and I think that's an important one, is that particularly in the South African context, how this has become also problematic is that in instances where you actually want the public to know what exactly the profession is doing and how the profession is conducting itself, it becomes difficult for members of the profession to then have a voice. Because if PwC came out, for example, and say, oh, by the way, the Steinhoff issue, it's an anomaly, it's not what the profession is about. Well, PwC has got a vested interest in that because they're being paid by Steinhoff to actually go and figure out what's going on. So you have that problem where each of the big four is going to be very anxious about speaking about in relation to matters, because all of us will then say, are you speaking up only because you want to secure the business? Are you speaking up because you've been called to clean up the business? So how can you actually trust, the authenticity of what it is that you're saying? So they've become entrapped into really the mechanics of the model, in that suddenly you see a lot of them not being able to speak out and say, oh, by the way, this is not systemic. This is not who we are. And in the absence of that ability to speak out and actually articulate what the issues are, unfortunately, the public perception will be that actually all of you are a problem.
I think you're right, and you say if all of them say individually, this is not who we are, well, then who are we if you constitute 91% of the market? Bernard, I wanted to ask, in terms of what Khaya said, he talks about that this is a long-standing issue in the Financial Mail story today, that audit quality was actually slipping for years. So we came to know of it when, say, KPMG was outed for the SARS rogue unit and for various other issues. But actually, his point was that audit standards were slipping for years. That is what IRBA has been noting, right?
Well, certainly from an audit quality perspective, which is slightly different to the quality of our auditing standards, because the fact that we were rated number one for 7 consecutive years, that refer to the quality of our auditing standards, indicating that there's not really a big problem with the standards themselves. It's more the compliance with the standards. And when we issue our public inspections report every year, we start off by saying that we are concerned about whether we think the standards are there, the standards are high quality, it's world-class standard, but are the auditors complying with those standards? That is the big question. And the fact that audit quality has been dropping has been noted in our reports. And as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the root causes for the audit quality dropping, it inevitably comes back to issues of auditors not being sufficiently independent, auditors not being sufficiently skeptical, them having long relationships with their clients, because we had to also stand back and ask ourselves, what are the root causes for audit quality dropping? But some of the other causes that we found was that it comes back to accountability. But in this case, it is the firms themselves not taking accountability. When we started to introduce measures to strengthen auditor independence, and we're happy that we did that because it certainly raised in the public eye and the public domain an awareness of how important it is for auditors to be independent. When we started to introduce those measures and continue to introduce measures to strengthen the regulator to monitor whether auditors are independent, auditors refuse to take accountability for what is happening. They themselves don't believe that there's a problem. Only recently, some of the firms have been very honest about the mistakes that they have made, and we can see that those firms are actually improving because they had started off by taking accountability. Some of the other firms refuse to take accountability, and therefore it means that they cannot address the causes, the root causes in their own firms that causes the audit quality, and we continue to see how the quality in those firms deteriorates. Of course, another root cause is about we talked about the fact that only auditors are regulated at this stage. There's fragmented regulation. There's no oversight over these other role players. So that is also a root cause for audit quality dropping. If audit committees, for example, were regulated, then those audit committees would also ensure that they play their role and address any issues at a very early stage. So the fact that there's no oversight of them also contributes, and it keeps on coming back to the fact that this is not just a problem at the audit stage, it's actually a systemic problem. And earlier it was also mentioned that the IRBA has fines of 200,000 Rand. We have one of our biggest projects to respond to the crisis at the moment, the reputational crisis, is to also strengthen the powers of the regulator. And yet again, it was met with so much resistance from the profession. And for us to try and convince the profession that this is really just so that we can only address the bad apples. For those firms that wouldn't be subject to our new powers, they wouldn't have to be worried. It's only the firms that are not complying. And it was important that one of the aspects that we addressed in our revision of our Act talked to the fact that we are limited by 200,000 at the moment. That is not in our power. The changes at least show that the minister can determine a maximum fine. But again, interestingly, the reason that part of the Financial Matters Amendment Bill, the part that related to the auditors, were withheld, and it was delayed because the profession did not accept that we need to introduce these measures. They resisted, and therefore that is why that part of the bill is still in Parliament. But if that bill, unfortunately our minister had mentioned in his budget speech that it will get priority. If that bill is passed, then at least those sanctions will also be increased, and we can start holding accountable those audit firms that are not compliant.
The Open Secrets Reports talks a lot about the reforms that have been suggested by Lord Bryden in the UK, which since we follow a lot of the same rules, we can potentially expect to filter through to South Africa. But Khaya, can I ask, one of the big issues has been the expectation gap between the public, which expects auditors to find fraud where it exists. You know, people do expect, at the case of Steinhoff, they say, what about the auditors? In the case of Tongaat and BBS, in Wirecard, in overseas, I mean, we've seen massive problems there. So the public expects auditors to be finding these kind of things. Auditors generally say, well, we weren't trained for this. Our job isn't to detect fraud. It's to express assurance on the financial statements. There's this big expectation gap. Is there any way to bridge that? I mean, should auditors now respond to the public expectation and consider finding fraud? I mean, if it's possible.
Look, I think, I mean, as I tried to say earlier on, the license that auditors have to operate is really what you may refer to as a public license. And what that means is that for as long as the work that auditors do is seen as legitimate and relevant by the public itself, then of course auditors will remain relevant. The problem that we have right now is that with every new scandal that we find, then of course the skepticism starts creeping in, and a lot of people are simply saying, well, clearly, perhaps the way that the audit work is conducted is not the type of thing that we thought it was going to deliver. So the key issue here, of course, is that in the big corporate failures, the element of fraud is always going to be the fundamental variable. The key issue here is that if society still doesn't have that understanding of what it is that auditors do versus what we think auditors do, then we do need to address that. So of course, every single audit report, at least a good one, will say that, in our opinion, the financial statements fairly present the state of affairs. That is a huge statement to make, because people then make a lot of decisions based on just that particular statement issued by an auditing firm. Now, the public will then say, on the basis of what you told us, which was a fair presentation, we made this particular decision. So we cannot absolutely leave you out of the conversation that says what went wrong. And of course, the concept of fraud probably taints the conversation a bit, because then auditors will immediately say, well, fraud was not part of our scope. But I don't think that really is the point. The point here that we need to interrogate is that if there's now clearly a need for a particular type of assurance activity that can at least interrogate the possibility of fraud being perpetrated, and then be able to say, this is what we did in relation to those fraud indicators, then of course that's where the audit itself needs to be paid to. I've been fortunate enough to sit in various audit committees, and I must say, and Bernard can attest to this, that type of questionnaires that I get in relation to, do you think that any fraud was committed? Do you promise us that you've checked it? I mean, it becomes very elementary and quite simply nonsensical questions, because every single person involved in the company is going to say no. I can't imagine that any of the auditors or any of the big four will say that we actually once got a questionnaire from management that says, yes, we think that fraud has been perpetrated, because of course that would mean new things. So then the question must be, if every single answer that you get is that nothing's happening, is the value in you asking the question altogether? Do you then need to be able to say, in spite of what we think is happening here, we're going to exercise this public license that we have to actually look beyond what it is that we traditionally looked at? And the bigger issue here is that, for me, remember, the existential risk of the profession is that for as long as people say you're giving us the wrong answer, people are going to stop using auditors. People are going to stop relying on auditors. So if we now know that fraud is the one thing that perhaps
Hi, sorry, the line seemed to just die for a second. I'm not sure if it was one of the big four auditors who, when you said stopped using auditors, decided we needed to intervene and make sure this the fiber lines just give out. Michael, I wanted to ask you on a similar vein. I mean, your report talks about the reforms, and part of it is addressing that expectation gap. There are a couple of other things you think might work, splitting the companies into consulting and auditing. I mean, these are ideas that have been out before. Do you think they'll work? Do you think they're enough? I mean, will it do what's necessary?
Yeah, Rob, I think that from our perspective, and certainly we try and bring this forward in the report, we don't think that there's one thing that you can do to fix the problems in the industry. And I think that what's come up from this panel discussion from all the speakers, which is so useful, is that you've got different sets of problems. So if you think about Mamello's point, I mean, we still are adamant that having firms doing consulting and auditing, often for the same firms, even if not at the same time, but concerned about those relationships for contracts down the line, it just creates a conflict of interest that I don't think that firms can manage themselves or manage their way out of. And so I do think that looking at splitting auditing and consulting would be a fantastic way of overcoming that. But I don't think it's enough. I think that you have to pair that with some of the other reforms that we speak about. One of those, which Bernard has spoken about at length now, I think is also crucial, is that IRBA and regulators like it have to have more power to intervene and sanction where they see something is wrong. So both on the investigative front, in terms of search and seizure powers, subpoena powers, we want a regulator that's able to be much more proactive in that space. And then I think we also need to start looking at the way different actors can come in and kind of take up some of the burden that might be left. One of the things we say in the report is certainly in the public sector, if you look at the state-owned enterprises, maybe we do need to now look at a system where state-owned enterprises boards are not selecting private sector forensic auditors for themselves, but that the Auditor General should be contracting those people, and that those audit firms should be responsible to the Auditor General for that contract. You know, just to touch on one of the case studies, which has some new information in the report, which is South African Airways, is that over a period of time, you had the SAA executive hiring smaller firms such as Injebo, and then later the large firm ENS to conduct forensic reports. Both of those firms are then beholden to parties who may themselves be implicated in the fraud and failing to meet their legal duties. And I don't think that that relationship is a good one to have. And so a more sort of forceful role for the Auditor General could be helpful there, I think. The last point I'd make on the issue of reforms that we make in the report, and it's really interesting to hear Bernard's perspective on this from IRBA's point of view, which is just that one of our central points is, although auditors have to be part of the discussion, we can't let them take it over, because they have in the past, and this is something we see across jurisdictions, they tend to reject that there's a problem, and they also tend to overstate the implications of greater regulation. So if you look at the discussion happening in the United Kingdom right now about centrally the same issues, about auditors being unable or unwilling to pick up on fraud, some of the reforms there have been met with a response by the Big Four that says, you know, you're going to ruin London as a financial sector. You know, the consequences of this will be catastrophic. And I think what we see is that those Big Four can tend to overstate the implications of greater regulation simply because they don't want greater scrutiny. And so one of the things we hope that this report does is that it brings a broader coalition of groups from civil society and other citizens into this discussion with the industry and with the IRBA to enter the discussion about what reforms should work, and not just leave it to the Big Four firms to dominate that conversation.
I think that's a good point, and I certainly think that what you mentioned about the regulator is valid too. Bernard, can I ask about that? Given your experience with the regulator, I found the 200,000 Rand fine levied on the SAA auditors to be a joke. I mean, how is that ever going to influence a company not to do the same thing again? It seems utterly disproportionate to the harm caused, never mind to the reputation of the industry. In terms of the auditor, the IRBA, in terms of greater powers, I mean, do you feel that the changes you've suggested will work enough? I mean, is IRBA strong enough? And why, for example, does it take so long to do investigations? We need accountability for African Bank, which collapsed in 2014, and yet that investigation is still continuing. And you're muted, I think. Am I correct?
Okay.
Thanks.
Right. You're absolutely correct in the sense that we have not been able to complete these investigations quickly enough. And when these investigations take so long, it means that the public continues to be exposed to those auditors out there. One of our challenges had been, and at the risk of sounding like we're making excuses, our challenges have been that we simply don't have the capacity at this stage. And also another contributing factor to the length it takes to complete a case is because of the complex nature of the investigations and disciplinary process at the IRBA. Unfortunately, it is in our legislation, and I'm really pleased that one of the important objectives of the amendments to the Act is to simplify this process. In some jurisdictions, even including the US, there's an internal process. You've got one person that takes a decision on whether the auditors are guilty or not, and of course, auditors can challenge that. But in South Africa, our Act provides for a process that is more complex than a high court process. It involves hundreds of lawyers, millions of rands, and unfortunately, we are bound by that process at this stage. The changes now makes provision for a smaller committee, for example, to look into the issues, and to deal with it much more quicker and much less more cheaply as well, because it won't involve us paying millions to lawyers and for the auditors to do the same. When auditors want to defend their misconduct based on legal process, then it just defeats the object. If auditors admit that they've done something wrong, they can go back and fix the problem. But to try and argue away legally that they haven't done anything wrong does not add to the fact that there had been poor audit quality. Audit quality and the audit process is not a legal process. It's a public interest process. And if auditors accept that by performing a good audit, they are protecting the public, they don't perform an audit so that they can come defend themselves at a disciplinary hearing. They perform an audit to protect the public interest. But to come back to the Act amendments, the other big change, of course, is the increase in sanctions, that it's now going to go up to an amount that can be determined by the minister. There's no limit on that at this stage. And again, we don't really want to regulate a profession by imposing harsh penalties, but the penalties at least must be commensurate with the misconduct. And at the moment, they're not. We are limited by what we can do at this stage, but hopefully that will also change as soon as the amendments are through. And at least a higher figure will act as a deterrent. I think the Open Secrets report also refers to the fact that to an audit company at this stage, an audit firm, that's just another expense to them. But that small expense to the firm doesn't even come close to the losses that are incurred by the public and by pensioners when something does go wrong in an audit. So I'm very pleased that the changes that we have asked for will certainly strengthen the IRBA. Those additional powers, although it's been resisted, if those can be approved and included in our legislation, then at least it also gives the IRBA the powers that it didn't have before, because a weak regulator is not going to be able to fulfill its oversight functions. And the Open Secrets report also refers to the fact that all regulators should have the power to be able to deliver on their mandate.
I think that's a very important point. And Khaya, can I just ask one thing before we go to questions? You've spoken about the leadership issues at IRBA at the moment. Not that I don't think the new CEO, Janita John, is well equipped. She seems very smart, and the people I've spoken to have good things to say about her. But it's also about the perception of a conflict, and the fact that she was the chair of Tongaat's audit committee might be a problem in terms of the public perception. Khaya, can you give me your thoughts about what that means for IRBA, especially given how critical it is in resolving exactly all these issues we talked about?
Yeah. So I think in the South African context, when we have the type of issues that we've seen, people will naturally gravitate towards looking up to the regulator to say, well, this is at least the independent and autonomous structure that is able to speak to the issues without having to worry about financial consequences of a loss of clients and things like that. So the role of a regulator is remarkably important, particularly when it regulates a public interest profession like the auditing profession. And I think the problem that we had with this announcement that there'll be a new CEO of IRBA was really the question of we had unresolved tensions around what really happened at Tongaat. And I think for me, obviously, anyone who's an executive authority of an institution like that is a person who gets to oversee all parts of the operations. And I do not share the view that is shared by the previous chairman of IRBA, Mr. Abel Dlamini, that there's some sort of Chinese war between the CEO's office and the investigations office. So of course now we have this strange set of circumstances where the new CEO of IRBA is going to have to deal with an investigations pipeline that includes an entity in which she was the chair of the audit committee. And of course, this is not an innocent position when we do talk about corporate fraud. Every single audit report would have been signed off by the chair of the audit committee to say, look, on the basis of what we've seen and what we've interrogated, then we do believe that this is a fair presentation of the financial state of affairs in an entity. Now, secondly, I think there is always the risk that, of course, the auditor who was in charge of that particular engagement, I think Mr. Gavin Kruger, is the type of person who may be called upon to testify. And of course, he should be within his rights to say, look, I wasn't alone in dealing with this. I mean, the type of work that I was doing was being overseen by the audit committee. And the audit committee in this case would refer to the very same person who's actually initiating or at least overseeing the investigation into Mr. Kruger himself. So I think it's a monumental conflict of interest. And we know, Rob, that generally a lot of entities wake up and find themselves that they've entered into a minefield or a conflict of interest. In this case, I walked into such a minefield, into such a conflict with eyes wide open. And in spite of our repeated queries that we sent to the board, as it was back then, to actually query the merit of and the wisdom of such a decision, they seem to have taken the view that in an instance like this, nothing needed to be looked into. And I felt that some of the responses that were provided to me, in particular with the board, were quite disingenuous. And I think this is probably something that is going to affect us in the long run, particularly because at some point in time, there will indeed have to be a conclusion on the Tonga Hewlett matter. And if this Tonga Hewlett matter then absolves everyone involved, including perhaps the chair of the audit committee, then a lot of people will say, well, of course it was going to absolve Tonga Hewlett because the person who's overseeing it is a person who's got a vested interest into what that conclusion is. So I do think that it's been a catastrophic decision that was taken by the previous board of IRBA.
And that's why I think we need a strong regulator, just like you mentioned. Guys, we've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to pose them to various people, if that's okay. Firstly, can I ask Bernard, perhaps, Johan van Lochenberg, who was affected by the KPMG report at SARS, he asks that in that case, KPMG, which conducted internal reviews, there were clear and direct conflicts of interest for KPMG in relation to SARS and the Gupta entities, and yet these weren't ever disclosed. I mean, essentially, are audit companies transparent enough in terms of their own internal processes? It would seem like they're not. I mean, they audit other companies, and that's where errors come in, but in terms of their own disclosures, they also fall short.
And I fully agree with the fact that the audit firms themselves need to be a lot more transparent. I think globally, there's been a call for transparency reports. And although I think the Open Secret Report, refers to the fact that the IRBA does not at this stage look and verify what's in those transparency reports, at least we've made a start. We started a process to require certain audit firms, mainly those of public interest entities, that they do start disclosing much more information to the public, because it's unfair that the public knows so little about the firm. In the Bryden report, they go further to suggest that there should even be more information about the audit teams, about factors that affect the people on the team of the of those performing the audit. And it just contributes to there not only being more transparency about the firm and holding the firm accountable to what they're reporting, but also it assists audit committees, for example, and those that rely on the audit report. It allows them to decide whether there had been audit quality, whether there had been auditor independence, whether the auditors were in fact competent. And together with our transparency reporting that we've started to require, we've also asked firms to start producing audit quality indicators, so that those that rely on their reports and on their services at least have more information about these firms. So I fully support it. It comes back to transparency. It comes back to the firms not being as opaque as Khaya mentioned earlier, that they need to also be more transparent. One of the root causes we believe that the firms are, that we're suffering this reputational damage at the moment is because of the lack of transparency. So we fully support the fact that there has to be more transparency, even though it's just in the beginning stages.
Michael, can I ask, I mean, another question that Johan van Lochenberg asks is, we speak about these things as accounting failures, and we don't use the word fraud enough, even though in some cases it's clear that there's an unlawful and intentional making of a misrepresentation. Is our language wrong on this? Are we papering over the cracks because it's not polite?
I think in many cases, absolutely, we are. You know, it's something that Mamello and I, when we were drafting the report, we would kind of continuously chuckle to each other that there was another, you know, set of accounting irregularities that had been found. And accounting irregularities, and the word irregularity has come to cover all manner of sins now. So, you know, you can literally have just a 2 billion rand cash hole in the books of a bank, and it's an irregularity. I think one of the difficulties around the language has been that in the case of Tongaat and Steinhoff, we know that criminal charges of fraud and a range of other crimes need to be pursued urgently against executives. And in the case of VBS, we know that with the KPMG auditor, there are criminal charges and we can refer to them as such. one of the really difficult things, particularly with the private sector case studies, is that we don't 100% know what happened at the audit firms. And I wanted to use this as an opportunity to raise a related issue here, which is the fact that the forensic reports done in both cases by PwC into what happened at Steinhoff and Tongaat remain secret. The firms have refused to release them. So, and what this allows the firms to do is it allows them to get one of the big four to do a forensic investigation and then to cherry pick the findings that they release to the public and then say that, oh no, the report is privileged. And this is, it's a real problem because we, for example, as civil society and investigators, are effectively then shut out of the findings. And this makes it quite difficult for us in all of those instances to say that an auditor specifically was engaged in that criminal activity because we don't have all the information. And I think that this is one of the things that Open Secrets is pushing for, and I know other entities, both journalists and civil society, are pushing for, that it should not be permissible that investigations into crimes of this nature that have such consequences for pensioners, investors, and other people, they should not be allowed to remain secret. They should be publicly available, and then we'd all be able to call it, call a spade, and we'd be able to say, it's unambiguous now that this was a fraud, this was a crime, and that the auditor was complicit.
Do you think that means if somebody's accused of murder, we can say they're involved in a mortality regularity from now on? I suppose we can reframe that language. I was going to ask Khaya, I mean, Bernard touched on this as well, but one of the questions we had is why has SAICA specifically, as well as IRBA, been so slow to act against those involved in unethical behavior? As Michael said, it's critical we act on this and we act on it quickly. It's like, it's like not testing anyone testing somebody for COVID and then waiting 6 weeks for the results.
Look, I think we do have to acknowledge that historically, IRBA in particular has got serious resource constraints. And those serious resource constraints simply mean that the type of investigations that should be initiated and completed expeditiously do take far longer to actually get them. But of course, we also know that we have a regulator that is fighting against the financial muscle of a big auditing firm that is trying to protect its reputation, and of course will throw as many lawyers and legal hurdles into the process as possible. I think that is probably a problem with the design of the systems that IRBA is currently being subjected to. So for me, that is really the starting point of where we are. Now, do we believe that perhaps that system itself needs to be overhauled in a manner that can at least, limit the time that it takes from the initiation of investigation to the finalization thereof? And I think there's definitely a lot of merit in looking at that one in particular. And I think also in relation to SAICA itself, we also have to acknowledge that actually the type of auditors we refer to are auditors that are registered with IRBA primarily. And of course, the SAICA disciplinary rules are then themselves subject to what the IRBA rules do. So if somebody is actually hauled before a hearing, that person will actually have to complete the IRBA process itself, and then SAICA simply responds to what the IRBA findings are. And I think obviously, if you look at it, I think to be honest, SAICA probably has greater financial muscle than IRBA does, and yet the type of work that needs to be done is work that then gets allocated to IRBA, which has much less financial muscle than SAICA does. So I think that's really one of the big issues that really leads to the two institutions being seen as being quite lethargic in really dealing with the type of issues. And of course, we have to keep emphasizing this, that these are not innocent crimes. These are crimes that have a consequence of affecting whether it's pensioners or other investors. So that becomes a big talking point that the public needs to feel that something is being done. And in the absence of those steps being taken, it does lead to a credibility crisis. And I think also another point that I wanted to refer to in relation to what Michael said earlier on is that we do also have to acknowledge the fact that the auditing firms in particular are still trying to protect market share and are still trying to, protect their own reputations. And sometimes what they fail to see is that comes at the expense of the profession at large, because then the longer you delay the process, it means it lingers in the headlines and people can only grow ever more skeptical about the profession itself, rather than saying, look, in this particular instance, we do think that perhaps we haven't been as good as we needed to be. So therefore, these are the steps that we're taking to correct our behavior. Because I think them thinking they can litigate their way through it, you can litigate your way through the process. You can't litigate yourself into public confidence.
Absolutely. Mamello, there's two questions that I think are relevant to the reform process that we've been talking about. One is, you, Michael, touched on it, the role that the Auditor General can play in terms of improving things, but also the functions of internal auditors. We often forget that internal auditors are involved, and in all these big scandals, they've been through the internal auditors. I mean, do you feel that we don't look enough at that? Do you feel they can play a much bigger role in future?
Yeah, and I think that's what we tried to do in this report, is show that it's not just about the private sector or external auditors, is that there's an industry-wide problem with the way in which auditors perform their jobs. They just aren't asking the critical questions that they should be, or when they do ask the questions and they're not answered, they let things go. You see, in the case of, I guess, the Wirecard scandals, that one of those auditors at Wirecard asked, where are the financials for these banks in the Philippines that are actually doing this job? And for 3 years, they gave unqualified audits, but they never had those financial statements. And that's the thing. You need to not just reform one actor. It's a conversation that needs to happen industry-wide. And I think the Auditor General can also play a bigger role in having that discussion. And I think they can play a check and balance in the case where you have, and where we see growingly, not only are the internal auditors embedded in the system, so are the external auditors. So in those instances, I think the Auditor General should often step in. And we saw in the case with the SAA case, that's what actually helped the case with what PwC and Nkonki were doing, was eventually when the Auditor General came in and examined those financials, they were able to see those gaps. And without that role strengthened, we might not be able to see that. And I think it's also important for those three to cooperate with one another, but then again, check one another. And that's something that we're not seeing. And I think it's almost as if they're in collaboration with one another in hiding this. And you would assume that one check balance is good. And when you have three, it should be amazing, right? And for the fact that some of those checks and balances aren't working is quite damning for the industry as a whole. So yeah, it is very important for holistic reform, and again to include the public actor, because this is again a public interest issue. So an actor that is assigned to care for the public beyond the ones that are just caring about profit making, they should also be involved in verifying these things. And I think you see that in the ways in which it affects people, is that you need a responsible public actor who people can ask questions of. So the Auditor General as well. Yeah.
I think of a responsible public actor as perhaps Matt Damon with a clipboard, but maybe that's just me. Bernard, can I ask, one of the questions is that it was talking about the need for auditors to do more to detect fraud. Is it feasible to expect them to? Because obviously audit fees are immense. You look at the financial statements of Steinhoff, or any other company, and they're pretty chunky already. I mean, surely auditors will then just charge way more, and companies won't want to spend on this, especially if it doesn't actually detect fraud. I mean, just practically, is it a practical thing to implement?
I think that the cost that need to be compared is the cost of paying extra to have this further work done by auditors, to the billions that are currently lost to investors and to the public and to pensioners. And then you can't compare the two. So if it means that companies need to pay more, yes, then they should pay more. Again, auditors, and we've been saying that unfortunately the standards do not cover fraud detection at the moment, but it doesn't mean that we can continue to say that. It means that we need to go back to the standard setters, and being influential in international standard setting, the IRBA has been pushing for this, is to strengthen the requirements in the fraud standard for auditors to pick up fraud. But again, it means that we have to start right at the beginning by ensuring that auditor auditors have those competencies. And that is why we're also at the moment looking globally and locally into how we can strengthen auditor competencies to include the ability to pick up fraud, because they're not trained as fraud investigators. But it doesn't mean that we should ignore it. We should do something about it, starting with changing their competencies. In the UK, in the Bryden report, for example, I think a very good start and a very good way to look at detecting fraud is to get the directors of the company to make a statement about the fraud and the fact that there is no fraud, and for auditors then to provide assurance on that statement. And that already would be a start in the right direction. So we might not have the procedures at the moment, but there are ways of dealing with it. And I think the way they're going to deal with it in the UK is a very good example of where South Africa can also start. But we can no longer say that there is no responsibility. We need to respond to the expectation that something more needs to be done.
Khaya, just the last sort of question, it relates, I suppose, to what are your thoughts on that point about asking auditors to do more on fraud? And perhaps you could also just comment on the really crazy Wirecard scandal, and what are there new implications coming out of that for South African auditing?
I think, obviously, when we do talk about extending the scope of what it is that auditors do, we really are going back to the question of purpose. And I think the Bryden report keeps emphasizing that we do need to go to the question of purpose again. And I think for me, when you ask the question of purpose, we need to start off by saying, perhaps when we designed the traditional audit model in the late 1800s, for example, the type of expectations that society had were framed around these particular issues. And now if you had to go out to society and commission a case study of saying, what does society expect when they hear that here's an entity, this entity employs 10,000 people, for example, and then annually the auditors go in and then they provide a form of assurance. If you went and asked society in general what they think that means and what then the expectations are, they would at least know what it is that society thinks ought to happen. And I think, obviously, in a survey of that nature, the question of fraud will definitely come through, because this is when the risk of losses is maximized. So if that is what society needs, then we need to be able to say the profession needs to find a way to respond to it. Now, how those responses are is then a matter of deliberation between the regulators, the practitioners, and society itself. But I think that we have to move a bit closer to addressing that gap. And if the fraud variable is the one enduring issue that still creates this disconnect between what society does and what auditors expect, then we need to be able to find a way to deal with that. I think, of course, what this will mean is that, yes, there will be an additional cost associated with this. But then again, as Bernard said, we have to be able to ask ourselves the question that if that cost is going to be avoided, what becomes the consequence in the long run when another Steinhoff tends to collapse? Does that cost of a collapse not exceed, the cost that we might say would be associated with this additional work that needs to be done? That's the first part. And I think also the second part that I always try to emphasize to people is that the fundamental limitation of the audit design currently is the whole sampling exercise. And the sampling exercise means that we are acknowledging that we're not going to look at every single transaction. We're going to look at a particular sample based on the risk assessment. Now, remember, the problem that auditors have is that when they go to a client, this client, if this is a client who's committed fraud, is not a client who's naive about what the audit process is about. So I always say to people, this is not a client who's going to steal 10 billion rand when they know that obviously there will be a red flag that auditors can pick up. This is the person who will say, if I do 10 or 11 different transactions of below a particular maturity level, then my chances of getting away with it are actually much higher. So remember, the people who commit fraud are not innocent bystanders who do not know or at least do not have an anticipation of what the auditors might do. So I think for me, what the audit profession needs to be able to do is to be able to articulate far more clearly that this is what we do and this is how we do it. And you shouldn't then be explaining yourself after the event to say, oh, by the way, we didn't look at all the transactions, because society then says, well, why not? Especially if you look at an audit fee, and then you say, well, for that audit fee, what do you mean you didn't look at this? And this is not a minor issue. This is a 10 billion issue at Hewlett, for example. So those are the types of tensions that we have. And I think we need to now start moving a bit closer away from the traditional model of saying we don't look at fraud and acknowledge the fact that the profession's existence is actually now dependent on its ability to respond to the current demands of society. And of course, if fraud is what the demand is premised on, well, then so be it. We must be able to respond to that. So for me, that's really what we need to start moving across. And I think, historically, something probably made sense when you didn't have the type of tools that would enable you to actually evaluate a much wider sample of transactions. When people talk about blockchain and all these new technologies, I assume that you can plug in some system in the beginning of the year that can be able to actually attract and do some fancy analytics. And the audit firms know that this is possible. So perhaps the response that we didn't look at everything is unfortunately no longer sufficient. It's just a question of who bears the cost of us moving to something far more comprehensive. And of course, do we appreciate that there are much better consequences when we do more comprehensive audit work? That's the key issue for me. I think the wildcard one, the most bizarre part of it is, every other audit failure is something that you can say, okay, that was a bit complex. Yes, even I, as a lay person, wouldn't have picked that up. It is quite disappointing to then find out that for 3 years, they didn't do perhaps the most elementary of all auditing tasks, which is to confirm what somebody says is available as money out there. But unfortunately, if you look at that and you compare it to Steinhoff, at least in Steinhoff, they were a bit sophisticated in dressing it up in some fancy quasi-cash instruments that had some allowance or some latitude in Germany. In this case, if Wirecard says, well, there's money sitting in a particular bank account, auditors shouldn't even have to rely on what Wirecard says. Auditors have the right and the ability to actually contact the counterparty directly and say, please confirm whether my client has this money. So that for me has been the most bizarre element of it, in that you cannot understand how just the most elementary things were not done in relation to that audit. And of course, the consequence for the profession at large is that people are looking at this profession, they're like, dear God, you've done it again.
Guys, I think that's accurate. I mean, at least we have world-class fraudsters in this country who aren't quite as blunt as that. We certainly hold our head high in that respect. And I do feel sorry for directors sometimes, and even auditors, because, we have some ingenious fraudsters who are the guys who are actually doing wrong. But just perhaps a last thought from you guys. Can you keep it quite short just on this? I mean, I think it's been a fascinating discussion and we've learned a lot from it. Perhaps to start with Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to say thanks, I think, to the panel also for joining us today. I think that the discussion has been a really interesting one. And also for us just to remember that, we're talking now specifically about South Africa and our world-class fraudsters. It's quite useful to realize that this is such a crucial conversation that is joining a global conversation about how to reform this industry. We tend to think of ourselves often in South Africa, both on the positive and the negative side, as exceptional and unique. 2 years ago, the audit firms themselves in a survey kept naming each other as that we had the best audit systems in the world. We were number one. We've now plummeted, I don't know how many positions, simply out of recognition of what has been going on pretty much the whole time. But it's great to kind of join this conversation. And I suppose my last point would be, it's been really encouraging to hear everyone here coming from quite different points of view, but also always returning to this fundamental point that this is a public interest issue which harms citizens fundamentally. Whether it's a corporation that is fundamentally defrauding shareholders, eliminating billions in pensions, or it's a bank where money is stolen directly from depositors in VBS, or it's the state-owned enterprises, the erosion of SARS by KPMG deliberately, or simply just the obfuscation of money that's gone missing in state-owned enterprises as the state continues to bail them out. This is why we've written the reports, and we hope that people engage with it kind of on those grounds and engage with it in the spirits of trying to move on to address those issues in the public interest.
Fantastic. Mamello?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Michael says. And I think it's also important to remember, leaving this, is the ubiquitousness of the auditing professional auditors in public and private sector. If you think about the fact that they are now probably consulting government as well in its responses to COVID across the world, you need to have them be accountable to the public, and they need to be thinking in the interest of the public rather than just in the interest of the bottom line. And that is one of the things that is we try to really draw attention to, is that the world is becoming increasingly financialized, and these actors are becoming more and more important to everyone. And they should be playing a role that is not self-serving. And I think that that's what I would hope that young auditors as well take into account when they enter into these jobs and when they enter into these positions, that they're thinking about the fact that it is about serving the public. And it's also important that the public starts to hold them to account. I think it should not be seen as something that is hard to understand, something that is over there and cannot be serving a function. I think that's both a failure of the industry to communicate what exactly it does. And it's also a failure of, I guess, civil society to like raise attention to a very important issue. And I hope that this is the beginning of one of those discussions where we have more and more people seeing this as something that they should be looking at.
Bernard?
Thank you, Rob. My final comments would just say that, in my final comments, I'd just like to go back to remind auditors that they need to go back to the basics. The Wirecard example again demonstrated that there are simple things that auditors need to do. It's not complicated. It's back to the basics when it comes to audit procedures. But similarly, auditors need to go back to basics when it comes to behavior. They simply have to behave ethically, remember to behave ethically, and they must remember to do the right thing. My parting message to the staff of the IRBA was also that if they, as the staff members of the regulator, remind themselves to always do the right thing, the regulator will be a strong regulator. And similarly, that is the same message that I give to auditors. In their behavior, just remember to do the right thing. I can only echo what Mamello and everybody else has said so far about the public protection. Auditors have to remind themselves that auditing is a public function. Auditors are public servants. They need to serve the public. And auditors just need to remind themselves with that basic concept. They are not there to only run a business. They are there to protect the public. In respect of comprehensive regulation, I still believe that if the whole financial reporting chain was regulated, it would have addressed some of the issues that we faced in the last 5 years. After sign-off, I can say that it seems like comprehensive regulation is already 5 years too late, and that needs to be pushed going forward. And in closing, finally, just that we must also remember that there are many good auditors out there trying to do the right thing. So yes, there are the bad ones referred to in the report, but there also are very good auditors that are trying to do the right thing. Thank you.
And finally, Khaya.
Look, I think for me, the key points to take away is that everybody in the auditing profession needs to be able to appreciate the fact that we actually are having this conversation is because we are trying to really address the fact that there is an existential risk for the profession at large. And I think it is an incumbent upon everybody who has an interest in the profession to actually make peace with the fact that we are in a territory where we need to do things differently, we need to do things better. And I think one of the questions that I was asked by Warren Thompson earlier on is, do I still think that an audit is relevant? Look, I'm still far more comfortable with the pair of outside independent eyes coming in to say, let us look at what has been reported by management and then giving me a statement to say, look, this makes sense or not. I think if we ever end up in a situation where people felt that the audit profession was irrelevant, we'd be much worse off as society. And given the fact that people who run companies are people who have a vested interest, and you cannot obviously hope that nobody becomes greedy in the long run. So I do think that the profession still plays a remarkably critical role. But I think that in South Africa in particular, it is important for us to have the balls to actually face the fact that this existential crisis did not emerge yesterday. It's part of a long-standing set of issues that would never been courageous enough to confront. And unfortunately, the longer we delay the process of the proper introspection, it might not be a profession to talk about in the long run.
Thank you. That's fantastic. It's been a fantastic discussion, technology notwithstanding. With us in person, I'd give everyone a bottle of whiskey, but I'm sure that I've been told that Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is sending over a bottle of whiskey and some cigarettes right now, so I'm sure it'll be done. But in the absence of that, thanks very much for the brain food. It's been fantastic. And to the viewers, please go read the full report and read the Financial Mail article on our website. Thanks very much.